Human 1.0 was like the medieval medicine era where people were like putting leeches up their ass and like bloodletting and stuff. Human 2 is this modern medicine era where we finally start introducing the idea of the scientific method. And then Human 3 is this idea that now that we have technologies that allow us to collect data at a much faster rate than we previously could, the flywheel of the scientific method is going to spin fast enough that we can reach sort of what the Silicon Valley people would call an exponential takeoff.
Let's say that someone is a PhD in some area. How should they then go about raising money?
So just try to find investors that are as close to the space that you're working in as possible. Shoot them an email, get an intro. I know everyone always talks about the importance of warm intros. I think they're kind of overrated. The best thing to probably do in college is to like join a frat and like learn how to make good friends while getting wasted, because that's going to be the one thing that AI can't replace. And that's how like deals are going to get done.
So we're in San Francisco today. I'm in San Francisco today, just got here. I came to visit Brom, and it's a bit of a crazy moment, to be honest, because when did we first work together, like 3 years ago?
Yeah, I'm going to go with April of 2022.
Yeah, probably
That'd be
around
my
then.
guess.
And we did the Empath website together.
It's true.
And that's when I still had a job, blah, blah, blah. And you like, leave your job. And I was like, no, I can't. It's so safe. I'm learning so many skills. And then eventually left. And it's just gone really well. And I've appreciated that, all the help that you gave me and all the advice you gave me. So...
Well, it would be really shitty if I convinced you to leave your job and then didn't try to help you afterwards.
Yeah.
It's a dick move.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But it's nice to
Things
finally
have
be here in
changed.
person.
Yes. From all the way across the pond.
Yeah. So, yeah. And we're drinking some nice coffee from LA.
That's right.
So, San Francisco, you just moved from LA.
Mm-hmm.
How's it going?
Yeah. So moved to San Francisco from LA on December 31st of 2024. So just like a week before the fires hit LA.
Yeah, that's so...
So good timing on that on my part, but it was tough to see people kind of like suffering there. The move was inspired by the fact that during COVID, I think it was like totally fine to run a business from a city that is not the epicenter of whatever business you're in. But it became more and more clear as time went on that I was probably doing myself a disservice by not being in San Francisco, which for better or for worse is the capital of venture capital. And so felt like if I was going to continue to grow, the firm needed to relocate to where all the action is. And the action is certainly here. I mean, I've only been here for 2 months, but the density of people doing things that are relevant to what I'm doing is totally unmatched by LA. Like we, put together an invite for people doing stuff in neuroscience and just put it out with like a few days notice and had like 20 people show up to this like random coffee shop. And in LA, like that would never happen. So it so far feels like it's paying off.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I can vouch for that. Like as soon as I landed at the airport, you just like at the baggage claim and there's like 4 different guys all with their headphones in, like talking about fundraising and startups. Leave the airport, every single billboard is like a B2B SaaS software, Notion, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it definitely feels like a smart city.
Yeah. My favorite billboard is the Stop Hiring Humans billboard.
I saw that one, yeah.
It's a little dystopian, especially when you see a guy like shooting up fentanyl like right underneath.
Yeah.
But, whatever. I guess it's just the world that we're living in.
The other crazy thing that I found about America so far is the Waymo cars. Still not used to that.
Have you driven in one?
No, I haven't.
Oh, well, we'll do it afterwards. When we go
Okay,
to dinner.
nice.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
It's weird. It's really weird.
Yeah, but you can't sit in the driver's seat.
No.
No.
You cannot. You
Damn.
cannot.
Okay. Well, yeah, I look forward to that. So I was listening back to our first podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You were my first ever client, first ever podcast. I always joke with my friends I'm going to name either a son or a dog after you. I'm not sure which yet.
Probably more fitting for a dog, personally. Those that know me will vouch for that.
But yeah, I was wondering, first of all, listening back to that cringed me out, which is a good thing, I guess, because it shows that I'd like to think I've grown. Like some of the questions, I was like, I can't believe I'm asking that, etc. But I think it was an interesting point because quite a lot of stuff has changed in your business since then. Specifically at the time, you were operating under the brand of Empath, which was a more psychedelics focused fund. and now the scope has broadened a bit. So I was wondering if you could introduce XEIA and explain the rationale behind that decision.
Yeah. So the rationale behind expanding outside of psychedelics, well, two reasons. One is that in 2022, as the market started to slow down from like the COVID mania, the number of new startups being started in psychedelics went from one every few months to zero, basically. And I guess I should probably have said one every few days, it seemed like at some point during 2021 to zero. And so if you're a fund that's only investing in psychedelics, very hard to do that when there are no new companies being started in psychedelics. And then the second reason for expanding is that we started getting deal flow in adjacent spaces. I think a lot of founders that were creating weird new technologies for brain and mental health were like, hey, these guys are doing psychedelics, which is a weird and out there technology for brain and mental health. Even though I'm not doing something in psychedelics, maybe I should reach out to them. And some of those deals were so interesting, like for example, Motif Neurotech, which is a company that you know well. It felt very silly to not take advantage of those opportunities. And so for those two reasons, started expanding outside of the psychedelic circle. And at this point, we've done a bunch of psychedelic stuff. We've done a number of what I'll loosely refer to as brain-computer interfaces. We've done a number of companies in like the genetic medicine space. We've also done one or two plays in the longevity adjacent space. And I think that almost all of those investments in some way or another are trying to solve the same problems that psychedelics are trying to solve, just with a different modality. And I think that if like the mission of the original fund was, solve these disorders of the brain, like mental health and neurodegeneration, why should you care if it happens to be solved by psychedelics or by some other method, right? Like as long as the problem is solved, the mission has been accomplished. And so that is, probably makes sense to diversify the different technologies with which you're using to solve those problems. In terms of the name, empath is a very like psychedelic coded word, I guess you could say. Empathogen is what people will use to refer to drugs like MDMA. And, there's certain types of people that you meet at psychedelic conventions will tell you that they are themselves an empath, which is, very annoying and funny. And it just seemed like as we were starting to talk to investors that didn't care so much about psychedelics, or maybe were even turned off by psychedelics, it would make sense to have a name that did not have that connotation. And after some various iterations, we ended up going by this name of XEIA, which is pronounced which is spelled XEIA, and it is an acronym that means transdisciplinary. That's the X. Took a little bit of creative liberty there. It's not T, it's X. Cross-disciplinary, X-disciplinary. The E is for exploration, I for investment, and A for acceleration, which is what we try to do. Once we've made the investments, we try to help the companies accelerate in their progress. So that's the story behind the new name. And I don't really like the naming process. It's a huge pain in the ass and very frustrating. And it really is a distraction from doing the important work of raising money, meeting new founders, investing in new companies, and helping those founders out. So after a pretty frustrating process, I'm glad that we have a name that we actually like and can stand behind. And now that we're raising the second fund, hopefully we'll never have to change the name again. And it'll just be that from here on out.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. I really felt your pain over the past few months. Like you were sending me a name. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, I like it. And you're like, no, I hate it. Yeah. This one.
It's pretty much what it is.
Yeah, that's cool. I really want to talk about Motif and like some of the companies like that, because what they're doing is so interesting. What's your latest on psychedelics itself, like psychedelic drugs for mental health? Because obviously the MAPS, was it phase 3? Mm-hmm. Their trial was rejected by the FDA, which sent a bit of a ripple through the industry. Yeah. So where do you think there's still space to grow in that industry? Is it going to take more time?
Well, okay. So that certainly was a roadblock. And there were a number of roadblocks before that, like number one just being the capital markets really freezing up, and other things like Matthew Perry overdosing on ketamine. That really made a lot of people hesitant to attach their name to anything having to do with psychedelics. But I think like the underlying problem that psychedelics are trying to solve which is the mental health crisis, that has not been solved magically. It's not like that problem has gone away. And all of the positive data around psychedelics being cures / treatments for mental health disorders, just because that one MAP study got rejected, I don't think that negates the entire body of work around psychedelics. And it certainly doesn't negate all of the positive anecdotes or individual experiences that many people have had. So I do think that it's only going to be a matter of time before one of the, whether it's MAPS' MDMA, when they redo the phase 3, whether it's Compass Pathway psilocybin, whether it's some of the novel drugs that some of these companies like Mindstate are trying to bring to the clinic, it's only a matter of time before some of those get approved by the FDA. And if you need like evidence for that, you can just look at the Spravato drug that Johnson & Johnson got approved back in 2019, I think. That's a ketamine derivative, and they're doing almost $1 billion a year in sales. So that's like, sometimes people act like, oh, you know, psychedelics have been rejected by the FDA, but they're really just referring to that specific MDMA trial. And it turns out that Johnson & Johnson is, as we speak, making like $1 billion a year selling a psychedelic-like drug that does cause hallucinations.
And that's not even penetrated the market yet, right? I've seen numbers that it was like, that's hardly even touched what it could touch.
Yes. I'm not super up to date on but I believe you're correct. It's like a relatively small number of people. It's just such an expensive drug that it's generating sales of that magnitude. So lots of room to grow there.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I think is interesting is that with this like Make America Healthy Again movement and RFK getting close, you know, to the seat of power, I'm starting to get a lot more positive interest from people about psychedelics. Whereas it seemed like 2022 and 2023 were very much kind of like doom and gloom. It seems like people are now like, wow, have you heard about this thing called psychedelics? It's like really cool. And RFK, you know, whether you like him or don't like him, they're like, RFK is excited about them. And so that means that there's going to be some kind of positive legislative action in the next, 4 years. So I think we're on an upswing in the psychedelic space.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like speaking to people, just health in general is becoming much more front and center of people's minds.
Yeah.
Like the effect of like plastics in the blood, the effect of just being inside all day, like sitting behind a screen, all of this stuff is not the optimal way for a human body to exist. So I feel like the appetite for everything in the human 3 space, as you call it, feels like it's increasing. When I was in Australia last month, I went down south to my dad's best friend's farm. And in this area, it's called Denmark. They all have like a bit of land, 4 cows, 4 sheep. And when they want meat, they just go and get a cow. And then they have a butcher who like does it. And I was speaking to all of those guys. And they all like dabble with things like psilocybin for mental health. And I've heard so many stories like that of how it's like helped to reframe trauma and see things from a new perspective. So I think that's very cool. The other thing that I think is interesting is mental health still isn't very well defined.
It's true.
Like working with Motif, I was speaking to John Nelson, who is their community advisory board director. I think he's called the lived experience director. And he had treatment-resistant depression, and he was explaining it to me. And I've worked with lots of companies who are solving that problem. I still didn't even understand it till that conversation. He was saying like depression is on a scale from 0 to 10, and it's like an exponential scale. So if you're 9 or 10, then it's probably one of the most dangerous diseases in the world because it can lead to some bad thoughts. Do you think, how do you feel about how mental health is defined at the moment? Do you think there's any progress there?
No real progress. It's defined pretty poorly. And like you mentioned, the varying severity of some of these things is hard for people who haven't been around the worst cases to really comprehend. I think that we probably need way better solutions for the people that are in that treatment resistant category, which I think technically means someone who has tried at least like 2, I forget if it's 2 or 3. They've tried 2 or 3 like FDA approved interventions and neither of them have worked, then they're considered treatment resistant. We need better treatments for people that are on that end of the scale. And we need better treatments for people who are not on that end of the scale, because usually you only get to the severe case after being in like the moderate case, right? Like no one goes from like okay to like severe overnight. Generally, I'm sure there are some exceptions. But we don't have very good ways to like accurately and quantitatively diagnose people. And we also don't have good tools to really like subcategorize them to say like, you're this type of depressed, you're that type of depressed, you're this type of anxious versus that type of anxious. We just kind of lump all these things together. And even the criteria for defining like someone who is depressed versus anxious, there's a lot of overlap in those criteria, which leads to very fuzzy diagnoses and very ineffective treatments. We also don't probably talk enough about the, like, I guess the social cures, you know, like not everything has to be treated with like a pill or a psilocybin trip or an implant. But of course doctors can't prescribe you to like go hang out with your friends, you know? So
Yeah.
I think that's a problem that the VC world and the startup world, or the medical establishment for that matter, is not going to be able to solve.
Yeah.
There has to be a lot of social determinants of the outcomes as well.
And interesting, you were saying there, like the moderate case or the severe case, from a product development standpoint, do you think the first companies to get approval for these treatments will be addressing the severe market or the moderate market or like the human augmentation market?
Well, most of the companies are, for the most part, trying to get approval for the severe cases first, because it's easier to get approval for something if it doesn't already have like a cure. You know what I mean? So if you're going after like the regular version of the issue of the ailment, you have to kind of show that your treatment is better than the existing ones. But if you go to like treatment resistant, then I guess like by definition, there is no existing cure, right? So the bar's a little bit lower. So,
and I guess with patient adoption as well, they're more likely to try something new.
Yeah, and that's not just the case for like the brain implants or the brain computer interfaces. Even like a lot of people are scared of doing a big dose of psychedelics, and if they are only like a little bit depressed, they might not be so willing to do it. Whereas if you're at the end of your rope, then you're probably willing to try anything. You know?
Can you relate it back to anything from? Is there any in the history of human health? Can you think of any innovations where there's a similar thing, where it was kind of hard to get through that adoption phase?
Where it was only like severe cases, like, or
just like when there's a new technology that's come in, and then, because I think it can be helpful to like look to the past to think about how you would do the present. I know. Do you know a guy called Semmelweis?
No.
He invented antibacterial soap.
Oh, interesting.
And he was saying he just wasn't very good at communicating. So even though he changed the history of medicine, he actually died very lonely and hated because he was telling all the doctors that they were killing people by not washing their hands.
Yeah.
And then, so his message was like, you're killing people. And
bad
that
message.
didn't go down well.
Yeah. I mean, adoption is definitely going to be slow for some of these things, like neural implants, for example. I think like people generally don't want to have surgery if they can avoid it. But the counter argument to that is like, look at how many people have breast implants, you know?
Yeah.
And you don't need those. You're not dying from a lack of breast implants.
Yeah, that is very true.
And those surgeries are like pretty intense, honestly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're talking about some little tiny minuscule implant that just sits on the top of your skull, and if you're telling me that that can make me happier and maybe like the jailbroken version can make me smarter, then like, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah.
You were just in LA. You saw how many people have breast implants.
Yeah.
Right? Like we do a lot of surgery. One thing that I think plastic surgery, like it's a funny analogy, but I do think it's actually useful. I was looking up some stats about plastic surgery, and I think in the US, it's like 3% of people have had some kind of plastic surgery procedure done. In South Korea, which is the plastic surgery capital of the world, it's almost 20% of the population.
Oh,
so 1 in 5 people has had some kind of like surgical
Seriously?
operations to improve a purely aesthetic thing.
Yeah.
They weren't dying because they didn't have this. They did it totally electively.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And LA would be like the appearance capital of
the
America.
US for the most part, yeah.
And this is probably the brain capital, so it makes sense.
Yeah, and if you really want to get into like the SF, like AI accelerationist mindset, if you like really think that AI capabilities are going to double, you know, every 2 years or something like that, And the only way we're going to be able to keep up is by being able to like increase the bandwidth with which we communicate with the machine world. Then like people forget about depression. People will probably be getting various types of neural interfaces for totally elective reasons, not even just as like a competitive advantage, but you might end up needing them just to like survive and keep up.
Yeah, let's talk about
unless you want to be in like the underclass, you know?
Yeah.
The non-implanted.
Yeah, let's talk about BCIs, brain-computer interfaces. Obviously, I'm sure most people would know about Neuralink because Elon effect, everyone knows about it. And then who are the other big players in that space, would you say?
You have to start by dividing up the space into two different types. So there's reading and writing, and some of them aim to do both. But there's this idea of like reading from the brain, which is what Neuralink is focused on. This is useful if you're trying to allow someone who, let's say, is paralyzed to control like a wheelchair or a mouse cursor. So that's reading the electrical signals from your brain, converting them into some kind of computer signal. And then the other version, which is more like Motif Neurotech, those are companies that are, for lack of a better word, writing to the brain. They're taking an electrical signal and firing it at your brain rather than reading it from your brain. And that could be anything from trying to zap specific regions of the brain which are associated with depression, to, if we fast forward 20 years as technology accelerates, to implanting thoughts into your brain, although we're nowhere close to that right now. Eventually maybe some implants will be able to do both, read and write simultaneously, but right now they're pretty bifurcated. So you've got Neuralink, you've got Synchron, which people have not heard about as much as Neuralink, but is actually much further along than Neuralink. They have their implant in I forget if it was 12 or 20 people. And that's a device that is reading brain signals and converting them into either like a mouse controller or a wheelchair controller for people that are quadriplegic. So that company's pretty far along. They've raised money from like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and a lot of folks like that. And then on the therapeutic brain-computer interface side, Motif Neurotech's a huge one, which is trying to treat depression. And you have some others that are a little bit less well-known that are trying to, treat other brain disorders. But one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that brain stimulation is not really like a new thing. People have been doing what's called deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease since the 80s. Like, it's a super old technology and it works really, really well. And it's now just a matter of improving the technology so that it's less invasive and the surgeries are not as problematic to go through. Currently, deep brain stimulation requires like getting a hole drilled in the top of your head and wires like shoved down into your brain, which really sucks. I can imagine probably sucks. So a lot of the effort now is not on like proving that neuromodulation works. We already know it works. It's more just on making the implants smaller and easier to put in.
That's what really stuck out to me when I started working with Motif. Mm-hmm. And Jacob, the founder, was explaining that the technology itself has already been proven, like the TMS, mm-hmm. But you used to have to be in a massive room which would stimulate the electromagnetic waves into your brain. Yeah. Because the size of the machinery is so big. But his lab discovered a way to engineer the same effect and put it into a tiny thing that could sit in an implant. Yeah. It's a large machine that you have to use every day for like 6 or 7 weeks if you want it to work. Whereas if you can miniaturize it and get rid of that burden, then ideally you can help a lot more people. And I have to say as well, the Motif team, I've never worked with a team who are all so like mission driven and mission focused and really care about the solution they're creating. Yeah, they care a lot. You can tell, because some people like they'll talk about the market size and like the total addressable market, how many customers they're going to get. But then other people talk about the product and the impact it could have on people and stuff like that. So yeah, it's very inspiring to work with companies like them. Who else in your portfolio are you excited about? I was going to say maybe it'd be interesting for people who are still new to the whole idea of human 3. Oh yeah. What's like let's say you were a very unlucky person with lots of different ailments and you go to 3 different treatments throughout the day, see 3 different doctors. What, in like the ideal human 3 world, based on the technologies we're starting to see, and with some of the companies that you've invested in, what would those treatments be and what is it going to do for them?
Well, the ultimate like long-term vision that we probably won't even accomplish with this next fund is instant analysis of the problem based on what's called multi-omics data. So like every different type of data that we could possibly collect about you, whether that's genetic, whether it's brain imaging, whether it's, blood biomarkers, all that data collected, and then a cure instantly or a sort of like combination cure of multiple drugs or therapeutics that are designed specifically for your biological phenotype, created and synthesized like on the spot and given to you. We're very far away from that for both scientific reasons and regulatory reasons, but that's kind of like the big vision. The idea of the Human 3 manifesto, if you read it on the website, is basically that Human 1.0 was like the medieval medicine era where people were like putting leeches up their ass and like bloodletting and stuff. Human 2 is this modern medicine era where we finally start introducing the idea of the scientific method into like biotech development. This started when people realized that there were germs. That's kind of like the initialization point of Human 2, where we're like, hey, maybe we can use the scientific method to figure out how to stop killing people, starting with, washing our hands after surgery. And then Human 3 is this idea that now that we have technologies that allow us to collect data at a much faster rate than we previously could, the flywheel of the scientific method is going to spin fast enough that we can reach sort of what the Silicon Valley people would call an exponential takeoff in human health, well-being, and flourishing. This, in theory, would have been possible under like the old Human 2 regime, but it's very hard to do experiments when it takes so long to collect the results. It's very hard to make, I should say more correctly, it's hard to make progress when it takes so long to collect data, analyze the results, and then integrate those results into the next batch of experiments. But I think now that we have things like CRISPR, now that we have new advanced neural imaging technologies, now that we have really cheap DNA sequencing, now that we have advances in machine learning that allow us to analyze like genetic sequences and the way that proteins fold at a much faster rate, I think we should be able to make a lot more progress in human health and well-being. And I would guess that we're going to first see the signs of this stuff coming to life in the areas where the modern medicine tradition has made the least progress, which is mostly mental health and other disorders of the brain, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and dementia. So that's sort of like the Human 3 manifesto, communicated verbally, I guess.
Yeah, it's so exciting. That's sick. That was a great summary.
Thank you. And you asked about companies that are doing interesting things. In 2024, we started investing in the genetic medicine category. And probably the most interesting company that we can talk about at this point is called Kerna Labs, Kerna. They are basically building large language model architecture, the same types of machine learning models that ChatGPT and Claude use, but rather than human words, they're training it on RNA sequence data. And so they can, in theory, understand why RNA is structured the way that it is and understand what proteins different mRNAs encode for, and then use that model to design basically any sort of RNA therapeutic for whatever outcome one might want. The reason that one might want to design RNA therapeutics is that, to use an analogy from psychedelics, so psychedelics work by binding to serotonin receptors that are in your brain and your body. The reason that your body produces serotonin receptors to begin with is because your body's mRNA tells it to. And so rather than designing like some new psychedelic drug that like attaches to your serotonin receptors, you could create an mRNA therapeutic that would tell your body to produce more serotonin receptors or to produce a new type of serotonin receptor that is maybe more sensitive to certain types of drugs or something like that. And so by understanding the structure of mRNA, you can create drugs of types of drugs that we really don't know how to create now. Like right now, we can basically just modulate our body's existing receptor chemistry, but with the RNA therapeutics, you can like really actually manipulate what your body's hardware, for lack of a better word.
I see.
It's quite
so
interesting.
Instead of changing the ingredients, you're changing like the actual like cooking apparatus kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of. That's a way to. Another analogy might be like
Yeah, that
if
wasn't very
most.
good.
It's like if most drugs are like talking to your biology, and then let's say your biology is like a microphone.
Yeah.
Most drugs are just like changing the talking that's going at your body. RNA therapeutics could like create a better microphone or like enhance your microphone sensitivity or maybe adjust the frequency response of your microphone or something.
At what point do you think we're playing God?
Probably like a few hundred years ago when we started, creating vaccines and washing our hands.
Do you think if I was a skeptic, which I'm not, but if I was,
if you were,
sometimes in medicine, like you hit something, it's like whack-a-mole. You take an SSRI to stop depression, and then something else pops up as a result. How do you think about that with all these new things?
Yeah, well, on some sense, this is what has been going on for a long time. And like human lifespan has gotten a lot longer over the last century. And that's good in general. Like people like living a lot longer, but we also are dying from things like cancer a lot more than we're dying from, early childhood preventable diseases and things like polio and things that we didn't have cures for before. So you're always going to sort of like reveal the next layer of the onion, which is like some new thing that you have to contend with. And of course, side effects are never good. Like if you end up with some therapeutic that causes more harm than good, then you probably shouldn't use that. But inevitably, as people start living longer and generally being healthier, you have to like die of something, right? So there's always going to be like a new thing that is revealed as the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that is kind of the whole philosophy of people who are technologists and futurists.
Yeah.
Like you drive forward with technology. Like with a car, for instance, you wouldn't say we didn't need cars because now we have to change tires.
Exactly.
It's like the car massively improved the transportation versus the horse. And now those problems are like marginal around that new level.
Yeah, exactly. And there are obviously questions of like medical ethics. Should we be growing like brainless clones of ourselves in vats so that we can harvest them for organs to do like organ replacement? That's something that is, surely debatable, and people have endless conversations about that. But as long as you're not like harming other people directly, I think it's probably better to err on the side of trying to make progress than to err on the side of, oh no, maybe something bad will happen if we try to make progress, therefore we shouldn't make progress.
Also, I think the data collection stuff you're talking about, some of these things would mean you don't have to do as much animal testing, because if there was a chip that was accepted and it could read your brain data, imagine how rich that data set would be, especially with AI.
Yeah. If you can do better measurements, then in theory you can run smaller clinical trials because you don't need as many samples to like average out a lot of the noise that bad data readings generate. So hopefully over time we'll be able to run like much smaller, more precise trials, and we'll be able to much more quickly identify if a drug is like not good. And so hopefully that will save a lot of pain.
Wasn't there a company you invested in a while ago that did, it was like an app where you could sort of do tests on yourself?
Yes, there are a number of companies like that. The one that you're talking about is Quantified Citizen, and there are some others out there. Those companies are doing some interesting work where they're trying to, the heater is, we have, RNA sequence in drugs, and the heaters can't even work properly. They were trying to give companies that are creating non-FDA approved products like supplements a way to run like decentralized clinical trials. And I think that's a very interesting angle, because we have a lot of things out there that like people sort of think work, and we know that they're safe. Otherwise the FDA wouldn't allow them to be sold over the counter, but they've never gone through like phase 2 and phase 3 trials because pharma companies really have no incentive to run trials on something that is like available over the counter. So by basically creating a low cost way for companies to collect data on if these like drugs work or not, they can at least like present that information on like the company's website or marketing materials and figure out like, does this supplement that I can buy, you know, online or on Amazon actually do something useful? And, you know, I think to some extent that's like an interesting problem to solve.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, things like mushroom teas,
Yeah.
when I see them and it's like, it does focus, anxiety and well-being. I'm like, I'm sure, I believe the benefits probably outweigh the negatives, but it would be nice to understand how the research was done a bit better, because I feel like that stuff can be a bit of a gray area.
Yeah. I think all those companies have kind of struggled to gain traction, honestly. But I think over time, someone's going to figure out the right way to like extract valuable data from OTC stuff. So only a matter of time.
What do you think, do you have any ideas about within this human 3 space, where do you think is the highest point of leverage, where there's a massive problem to solve, where there's a technology that seems very well fitted to solve it? Like sort of with software, Uber, taxis.
Right. Well, the mental health crisis we've talked about quite a bit, so I don't want to keep talking about that. And, you know, I think psychedelics and neuromodulation will probably be big winners there. I think that there are a couple of areas that are relatively under looked at the moment outside of the brain health stuff. One is fertility. If you just read like any Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg article about this, you'll see that fertility rates globally are declining, and a lot of people want to have kids and they're not able to. And the technology that we're using for IVF is like 30 years old. So I think that just any sort of research or startups in that area, probably like very well worth it. We looked at a company recently whose main concept was taking stem cells, and they had figured out a process to take those stem cells and convert them into healthy sperm cells. And that's interesting because according to them, 50% of the time that IVF fails, it's because the father can't generate healthy sperm cells. And so if you have a way to take the father's stem cells and then turn them into healthy sperm, then you can solve like 50% of IVF failures.
Wow.
So companies that are doing work like that, probably worth looking into.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think people realize that that is a looming problem, like depopulation.
Yeah.
Most people that I speak to will always say like, oh, we have a population problem, which I have a massive like philosophy. I just have a massive problem with that statement, because if you say we have a massive population problem, you're
talking about the people that say there's too many people.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So like, what do you want to do about that? There's only one thing you
Sure.
can do, and I'm not sure how.
Yeah, you can kill a bunch of people, or you can do
Yeah.
it very slowly by sterilizing people, or
Yeah.
just making economic conditions such that people aren't able to have kids, and then the problem kind of takes care of itself. But yeah, I don't think people really want to live in a world of degrowth. It's pretty painful.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I don't think people realize that if you have a business, if you have anything, that would be it wouldn't just like slowly drop off. It would be exponential on the way down as well.
probably pretty drastic. Yeah, it would be bad. I mean, there's certainly a question around how much of the population crisis is due to like infertility versus just people not wanting to have kids. I don't know that like solving the problem of people not wanting to have kids is like a VC startup thing to solve, but we can at least try and solve for people that want to have kids that are having a hard time. How can we help them? So anything in like the sexual health and reproductive space, I think is probably like ready for disruption. And then the other area that this is a little bit more niche, but I think that we're going to end up in like a giant hearing loss epidemic. And this is because up until 10 years ago, people were not blasting their ears with AirPods all day. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. Probably started when Beats by Dre became popular. I think those were like the first mass market headphones that people were just like blasting nonstop. And now it's like people cannot take AirPods out of their ears. They always have a podcast on. They always have music on. And I don't think we realize like what that's going to do to our hearing by the time we're in our 40s or 50s. And so probably solving problems like tinnitus, which is when you have the ringing in your ears constantly, solving just general hearing loss is something that, like, hearing aids suck and they don't even work that well. and no one wants to wear them and have like a thing sticking out of your ear. And there are probably all sorts of interesting ways to solve that, whether it's like neuromodulation, whether it's genetic medicine, whether it's like actual implants into like the ear. Probably a space that is going to be really big in like the next decade.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, sometimes I wake up and my thumbs are like,
oh yeah,
sore.
the arthritis one too.
And yeah, that's
from texting too much.
Yeah, that's a very real thing.
Yeah.
Some people are going to have a bad index finger from all the doom scrolling.
Well, that I think humans might evolve to just having like a thumb that constantly scrolls. You know, we won't need these hands anymore.
Well, if Neuralink works, you just do it with your eyes.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah.
You can just look.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything, because I know you're into your fitness, what about like the testosterone or endocrine system, so estrogen for women as well? Because there's so many endocrine disruptors in our natural environment now. Is there any scope for fixing that beyond switching away from plastics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there's going to be a lot of like drug development towards hormone replacement therapy. I think for that, testosterone and like just straight up testosterone and estrogen is probably going to be pretty hard to beat. There are probably going to be some interesting companies around undoing the damage that things like microplastics have solved. So I saw this company a while ago. We didn't invest in them, but their whole thing was they had engineered like this probiotic that they had shown basically would eat plastic and digest it, and it would excrete just like harmless molecules. And their idea was like, if you just take this in like a capsule, then it will float around your body and just like scavenge for the microplastics and eat them.
That's cool.
So I don't know if like it was actually legit or not, but I suspect that there will be other things like that will maybe help us undo some of those like environmental damages. The term that I've heard thrown around is the exposome, which is like all of the things that we're exposed to, including microplastics, bad things in the air, et cetera. And the question of like, how do we heal the damage that the exposome has caused? Yeah, it's like starting to get more and more attention.
Having traveled here and felt jet lag, and you feel your circadian rhythm doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. And I was wondering, have you ever thought about the impact that travel has on people? Like, if you constantly jar your body into a completely different time zone.
I mean, I think it's well established that it's pretty bad for you.
Yeah.
So, and there really is no way to fix that other than sleep. I'm not a big believer that we're going to come up with some sort of drug that like makes you not need sleep. Pretty much any time that's been tried, it's ended up with like, you know, people just being addicted to like meth or modafinil or Adderall or anything. Like,
that's probably one where you could say that is playing God too much, because sleep probably such a powerful thing. There's so many things it's doing in one go.
Yeah.
I don't know whether human invention right now or anytime soon will be able to cover all of that.
Probably not. I mean, the one area where you might see something in the sleep space is, and I've not really read much on this at all, but supposedly there's a genetic mutation that makes people need very little sleep. Supposedly Obama had it, and he would sleep like 4 hours a night and he was totally fine. And there are other people that supposedly have this genetic mutation. This might be total bullshit. People should like look this up. But if it is indeed the case that it's a well-identified genetic mutation, then in theory you could like do gene editing on IVF embryos and like decide like, I want my baby to have this mutation so that he or she doesn't need as much sleep. And then you can, you know, have like a kid that just works 20 hours a day instead of 16.
Designer kids.
Breed them for the factory.
The kids coming out of Los Angeles are going to be crazy over the next 100 years. What is your process for analyzing companies, and how has it changed? Because you say there, like you've seen some and you chose not to make the investment, others you do make the investment.
Yeah. So
what do you look for?
There are a few things, and it's always like, I always feel like when I try to put it into words, I can immediately think of like counter examples that would have fit those criteria and we didn't invest in for whatever reason. But it's generally, first of all, it has to be within our space. So like something like neuro related, something future of healthcare related. It needs to be something that if it works, it's going to be a massive like step change in efficacy relative to whatever the current solution is. So for example, like psychedelics, if they work, they're probably going to be like 10 times better than SSRIs, right? So it needs to be something with that level of impact, not something that has like a slightly marginal impact. So that's kind of the first thing. It's like understanding if this thing is going to be really big if it works. And then the second thing is is the person that is presenting the idea, the founder of the company, are they, the phrase we always use is uniquely qualified to execute on the vision? Like, to use Motif, for example, the idea is like a good idea, but if someone other than Jacob pitched it, it like wouldn't make as much sense, right? Because Jacob is very much uniquely qualified to like be the guy running that company. And I think pretty much every other company that we've backed also has like the same story, where there's someone who, if you tell the story of their life and you didn't say that they're now doing the startup, people would guess like, oh, and I bet now they're doing the startup, because the story of their life up to this point, it just like makes sense that that's the next thing that they would do. So like the guy that started Kernel Labs, the RNA company that I was telling you about, he did like his PhD in a relevant space, and then he spent like the last 8 years as the head of platform at one of the first like machine learning for RNA companies. So like he's been doing this thing for like 10 years and decided it was time for him to, you know, go out on his own and do his own company. So that's generally what we look for: ideas with step change potential and founders that are uniquely qualified to execute on bringing that product to life. Everything else, I think, is just like window dressing for the most part.
And so far, what evidence have you seen for or against that hypothesis based on like follow-on rounds and stuff? Or is it still too early to say?
I think that what we have, it's still very early, because the investments that we have made, they're all like pre-seed and seed. And so, you know, we don't expect to have any IPOs or anything by now. What I have seen is times where we made investments that did not follow those rules. Those have struggled or failed. So, you know, for example, we invested in one of these ketamine telehealth companies, and I don't know that either of those criteria were necessarily met. And that company ended up, you know, basically going to nothing. And then there have been a few other companies where it was sort of like a similar story, where like the idea like kind of made sense and the people behind it were like kind of compelling. Maybe they had like some kind of celebrity, and I don't mean like a Hollywood celebrity, but like a celebrity in the space that was, you know, on their advisory board or something. And we're like, oh, the fact that they're associated with this person, that means that it's going to be successful. It turns out none of that stuff really matters. It's really about, I think it's just those two things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think in terms of, you can reverse engineer that even for your own life. Like, I think when you see, or if you speak to a friend who's got a new business idea,
yeah,
anyone can have a good idea, but not anyone's qualified to execute the idea, for sure. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. And I think that, look, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you can probably think of an example of a company that doesn't fit those criteria that are very successful. Two like caveats. One is that this is specifically for like the science heavy businesses. The reason why that uniquely qualified thing is so important is because there is like some level of scientific understanding that's required to like build a brain computer interface, right? It can't just be like the average person or someone who's very enthusiastic. And then the other thing is that there are definitely people who become uniquely qualified over time, and maybe they weren't uniquely qualified when they started out, but as they like built the business, they became uniquely qualified because they gained the experience along the way. But when you're investing at the inception stage, which is what we do, it's kind of hard to like predict, this guy may not be uniquely qualified now, but he will be. We just give him enough time. That's a bet that I think is a lot harder to make. So we try to not make those bets.
What is an indicator to you of when founders pitch to you to raise money? What things do you see where it either turns you off or you think it's an overly used form of messaging or something where it just seems cliche and you ignore it? Or
yeah, well, the cliches change over time, right? Like right now, AI is a cliche, and so every company that we see has like some AI story, and that it's not to say that AI can't be useful, but it's like you need to do more than just say the word AI. You know, you need to like talk about how it's benefiting you and what your unique AI angle is. The cliches, again, they just like shift over time. I think that the turn-offs are generally when people have a little bit too much of that like Silicon Valley ego, where they like get on the call and they're like, yeah, dude, you know, our round is already oversubscribed. So like, I don't even know if there's going to be enough room for you to get in. And I'm just like, all right, it sounds like you don't need us then, like, peace. That's always frustrating to deal with. I understand why people do it, because that stuff does unfortunately work on a lot of people, but I think it's kind of phony. When people do things that are very obviously like on the verge of lying, I think that's, you know, obviously a bit of a turnoff. I'm trying to think of other things that are a little bit more like non-obvious that are turnoffs. I would say that, yeah, just when you talk to someone who clearly understands the problem space that they're working in and has like a long story about why this thing is so important and why they are the person to do it, that is like what makes me excited for the most part.
So let's say that someone is a PhD in some area.
Yeah.
They've found out so much about the depths of this specific scientific area, and they're becoming more and more aware of the problem space that their research exists in.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, I'm going to start a company. They've got a few advisors on the board. They've got maybe a couple of people to work with them. How should they then go about raising money? Who should they raise money from? What's the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think they need to do research on firms that have backed companies that are like similar to them before. You definitely see a lot of people just like trying to talk to every single investor in the world. And I think that is like a bad approach. You know, you don't want to be pitching biotech to a non-biotech investor, like a generalist investor. And I think it's ideal if you can go in and not just in like talk to a biotech investor, for example, but someone who has like some specialist focus on the thing that you're doing. So, for example, like we always love talking to founders that are building in like the neuro-related space, because we've invested in a ton of companies in that space and we know it well. And so we can have like real deep conversations with founders that are doing that sort of thing. So just try to find investors that are as close to the space that you're working in as possible. And then shoot them an email, get an intro. I know everyone always talks about the importance of warm intros. I think they're kind of overrated. I think that if you're really a good fit for the investor, they should respond to cold emails. So that's probably the first thing. And then the second thing, and this is like pretty standard fundraising advice, but don't get hung up on like the technical details. You should be able to just like present the problem, the solution, and like why you're the right person for the job very clearly without jumping into the weeds too quick. You know, figure out how to make a 10-page deck that covers the whole thing. And I know like science people and like PhD people, when you hear me say make a 10-page deck, you're like, well, that's a normal person listening to his advice would make a 10-pager. I'm going to make a 12-pager. Like, no, actually make a 10-pager. Make a 10-pager and then maybe add 2 more later. But like, see if you can just do it in 10 slides, including the cover and the like the back slide. So really just 8 slides. See if you can do it in 8 and then go from there. That's
really helpful advice, because I see that all the time. Like people go so far into the weeds, which is understandable because if you're at that level of understanding of something, it probably doesn't even seem like the weeds. Yeah. They probably already summarized it. Yeah. But maybe like for the first deck that you see as a VC, what are you actually looking for in that deck? Because you're not doing due diligence at that stage. Sure. Is it just like a teaser that's going to, like, what are the levels that a deal goes through before you invest? And where does the pitch deck come into transitioning between levels? Yeah. It's a good question. I think that teasers are very good because most VCs end up with lots and lots of decks in their inbox, and it takes a lot of time to like read through all that stuff in addition to doing everything else that you have to do. So people don't have a lot of time to spend on your decks. It's not just because VCs are stupid. We are stupid, but it's not just because of that. It's because we don't have a lot of time to like actually read through things. So being able to just like very clearly communicate those things that I just said, like what is the problem?
what is your like secret sauce solution, and then what is like, who are you and why are you important? Just that's all you have to communicate in the first deck, I think. And then as time goes on, like, there's a lot of, people generally will have like data rooms and that sort of thing, and you can add more technical detail there if you need to. But I think even there, people oftentimes try to put too much detail in those spaces and end up overwhelming people with information. One of the things that you'll see sometimes is like the first call will go well, and then the person will say like, do you want to see the data room? And it's like, sure. And then you get access to the data room, and there's like 1,000 things in the data room. I have seen a lot of people have a lot of success with when the investor says, do you have a data room? You respond with, no, but I'll put one together for you. What would you like to see in it? And then make the investor specify what they actually want in the data room, then make like a custom one just for them. That way they're not overwhelmed with like thousands of folders with like all sorts of shit in there. Mm-hmm. I've seen some data rooms where literally, and I don't mean this is like a bad thing, but there was one data room that had like a folder that was like pictures of the company and of like the people at like their team building events, like at the bar. And I'm like, why? I get it. It adds like a human touch or something, but it's like, did we need that? That's just another folder I had to like click through.
Yeah. I think that's a general point. If you're making anything on the internet, whether it's a website, a post, try and read, or even an email. If someone sends me an email and it's got 4 thick paragraphs, I pretty much immediately just scan it.
Yeah. And
then see if there's any action. Then I'll respond with one line to that specific action, because time is limited.
Totally.
So I think if you're not being brief with that sort of stuff, you're already... And I'm just being honest about that. I'm sure that 90% of people would do the same.
Sure.
They might pretend they didn't. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, they don't read it. I think a lot of the other stuff that's helpful when fundraising, people get too hung up on like the pitch deck, this and that, right? Like all that's important. But just in general, like the way that you kind of conduct yourself can make a big impact too. So like, for example, responding very quickly to like a question that an investor asks over email. Some people will take like 24 hours or, even like a week to do that. And I think that not only does that show that like, you take a while to respond, but it also allows you to like fall a few rungs off in like the minds of that person. Like when they sent you the question, you were top of mind. And now by waiting a week, you've like fallen down to like wherever, you are in that person's like mental stack. So being hyper responsive is super helpful. I think that's something that is not talked about enough. If you've ever worked with like lawyers or investment bankers, they know the definition of hyper responsive. They like respond in 90 seconds to anything, no matter what. And that skill is like super, super useful for raising money or getting clients or doing anything. And then just being able to communicate really clearly, like over email, practicing your writing, making sure that you're not like you said, paragraphs, just like getting good at that sort of bullet point style communication is good. And then keeping people updated and knowing how to like nudge people when they invariably, like they do, like forget to respond. Like, so when the investor says like, I'll get you a response next week, and then they don't, like knowing how to sort of creatively nudge them without being annoying. That stuff also seems to help.
Yeah, and that is difficult.
Yeah.
It's like the trade-off between being able to go deep with your work and then being always available. I guess that's kind of the role of the CEO, right?
Yeah. And I guess like I was actually just talking to one of the folks who runs a company that we invested in earlier today. He's like a scientist. And we were talking about the fact that now that he's like the CEO of his company, he doesn't really get to do science anymore. And he like thought that by starting the company, it's like, oh, this is me getting to do science as the CEO of my company, but really he's like the CEO. Yeah. And it's the same thing with me, by the way. Like I've worked in the investing space for a long time. I worked at a hedge fund for 7 years. And when I was at the hedge fund, I would spend all day with my headphones on, giving myself hearing damage, listening to house music, writing Python code to analyze the financial markets. And then moving into VC, I wanted to be able to continue doing that sort of like deep thinking on the companies that we're investing in. But unfortunately, I spend a huge amount of my time like fundraising, doing admin stuff. And like, it just is what it is. Like if you want to run a business, you have to do a lot of that shit. And so figuring out how to get it done quickly and like just submitting to the reality, I think is helpful.
Yeah, for sure. What was the company you invested in today, or is it stealth?
It's a stealth one,
Okay.
but they will probably de-stealth within the year
Okay, nice.
in the genetic medicine space.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, they're very cool.
And I noticed the team has like changed a bit. You have a new scientific advisor at XEIA.
Yes, we do have a new scientific advisor, and we are going to publicly announce her soon. So I'm not going to say, we haven't put, there's going to be like a coordinated announcement. So, but yes, a very cool, high profile advisor from MIT that's going to sit on the scientific advisory board. So we're excited about that. Sorry, I can't do it now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. And the aim of that will just be like, it will improve your scientific due diligence side of things.
Yeah, to some extent. I don't like it when VCs rely too much on advisors for diligence. I think where advisors can really help is by giving you like an academic's view into what the cutting edge of research looks like. And then you yourself can compare the companies you see against that cutting edge of research. I think that asking, some tenured, like high profile professor to be like doing diligence on a specific company is probably a waste of time personally. They've got better things to do, and you're probably looking at so many companies. There's just no way that you could really ask for their opinion on all of them. So it's more like getting them to just inform your view of the space.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
What other value does XEIA bring to companies? Like, why should founders look to you to raise money? I know that Silo is a good example of.
Silo is a great example. We, relative to the size of the fund, do a lot of work to try and help these companies along operationally. So Sam, who runs the fund with me, she has tons of operational experience in the life sciences. And for example, she's currently working with our portfolio company Xylo, helping them with business development. And she'll probably be in that role for, the next 6 months or something like that, helping them get to their next milestones. And we've helped a number of our companies get partnerships with pharma, hire people from our network, and do all that stuff. And it's funny because every single VC always talks about like their value add. And as a VC, you're supposed to be like, look at all this value that I add. Isn't it impressive?
So much value.
So much value. And like on the one hand, that stuff does happen. Like the things that I just said are true. They did happen. But it's like, if you think about like the ideal startup or the ideal founder, they shouldn't need any of your help, right? Like if they're so fucking amazing and you're really investing in like these super top tier founders, like they shouldn't need any of your help. And so like, it's almost like a better pitch would be, we just find really good founders and they're so good, they don't even need our help. That's like the ideal world would function that way. We don't live in the ideal world, so we still end up helping the founders that we back. But it's a funny question to answer when prospective investors ask it, because it's like, well, if we're so good at helping them, maybe we should just run the companies ourselves.
Yeah.
Like the whole point is that they're the ones that are the experts at running the companies, not us. But we do try to help to the extent that we can.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess the value add then for the founders is that if they have XEIA on the cap table, it's like a stamp of approval.
Yeah, stamp of approval. We're relatively selective relative to a lot of other funds that invest in pre-seed.
And I know that 'cause I know there's companies that you've not invested in that I worked with, and I was like, oh, these guys are great.
Yeah, I mean, that's also because maybe we just make bad decisions sometimes. But
yeah, that's also true.
A lot of funds will invest in like 40 to 60 companies at pre-seed. We've done like 23, and that's pretty much, we might do one more out of this fund. So we are relatively selective, and we do our best to help the companies that we do invest in raise more capital, do better operations, get partnerships, et cetera. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Also, XE is a pretty cool name.
Yeah, actually,
so
having
having that on the cap table helps.
Yeah, I really like it.
It's better than something generic.
So, you reckon you'll be done at 24?
Yes.
Okay. How many? So
23
so
now.
far.
Yeah, so maybe just one more out of this fund.
Yeah.
And then it's a matter of raising the next fund and investing in another 20 companies or something like that.
Yeah. Of the other VCs in the space, how many companies would you say are like possible to invest in the space at the current size it is?
You mean in sort of like this like human 3 space?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a good question, and it depends on how you define it, but easily over 500.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got a cold email today from someone saying that they could help me get 5,000 more leads.
It's a lot of leads
in the space from deep tech companies. But
well, deep tech is a much broader field for sure. But if you're looking specifically at like biotech with like a neuro focus, it's much smaller. I don't even know what deep tech means.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably quite important or it's an interesting thing to talk about, because people who are more used to investing and being LPs in VCs that back SaaS companies,
yes,
that's kind of like an unlimited pool of, like, the business model could be applied to so many things. You can really just like throw loads of stuff at the wall, and that is the best way to do it. And then like if you invest 100, there's 2 unicorns, job done. Do you think the power law applies as much in this space, or do you think there's because of the?
It's a good question. I mean, I feel like the power law is one of the most cliche things that gets talked about in VC. And I almost wonder if the power law is like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that it's become such a like talking point that I think a lot of VCs use it as like an excuse for making shitty investments. Cause it's like, if you're a big like power law guy, then when one of your investments fails, you're like, hey, that's just the power law, bro. Like, what did you expect? You know, I told you most of the companies were going to fail. And then of course you have some of them that end up winning big. But I wonder if people were exposed to less power law propaganda, if they would be more thoughtful in the investments that they make, because they wouldn't have this like, well, most investments fail narrative to fall back on and to use as an excuse. So that aside, to actually answer your question, does the power law still apply? You can there's actually data on this, and you can look it up with biotech and drug development specifically. One of the interesting things about biotech is that a lot of the large outcomes are smaller than they are in like the traditional like SaaS world, but the failure rate is actually lower. So you'll get companies that, you know, maybe you'll get companies that might get acquired or IPO for just like a 2 or 3x. And then you'll have some big winners that are like a 10 to 50x. You won't have like the 10,000x that you might with like, you know, Facebook or Uber or something like that. But I think and the reason for that is because in the deep tech or the biotech world, even if a company ends up failing, oftentimes it's developed like some IP that is useful to someone in the world. And the company is worth being acquired for that. So it's like if Elon like failed to get any of those rockets to, like if he failed to get the fucking like Starship Heavy to launch, there were still a lot of interesting things developed along the way that like someone would probably have use for, right? Whereas if you just have like some shitty like SaaS product that like if people just decide they don't want to use it, there was nothing interesting invented when building that SaaS product. It was all just like boilerplate Python code and like, you know, React front ends. And that's worth zero basically, unless there's paying customers.
Especially now.
Right. Especially now. Yeah. So whether you're building robots or whether you're building rockets or drugs, like even failures can result in like some useful shit being invented, and hopefully someone will buy it.
Yeah, that's so true. And as you know, like I really love this idea of like thinking of the Earth as a spaceship.
Sure.
And nothing helps that mindset like flying, because you see from, even when you're on a plane, which is kind of the highest up you can normally go, you still can hardly see
the
like
curvature.
Yeah. It's the Earth is so big that we really don't have the perspective to see it like that. But I think if more people were inspired to follow science and engineering, it's actually so inspiring, the stuff that humanity can build.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be a pie where we're all taking a slice. Like you can grow the pie. Totally,
man. Yeah. I mean, technology is like the primary way to grow the pie too, because technology allows people to do more with less. And that is like the definition of growing the pie.
Yeah, exactly.
Like most other businesses actually don't grow the pie that much, but technological advances do.
That's why I don't like SaaS, because they re-slice the pie and then give you the same.
A lot
piece
of times
of pie.
they do. Yeah. They really do. It's kind of insane.
Yeah. And I think people realize that knowledge is completely infinite in every single direction. So like, even if all the technologies we've just discussed came to be And I especially think this with AI. People think that AI is going to take all the jobs and that's it. But we'll just elevate to deeper or higher up levels of problems that we don't know yet.
Yeah.
They're still going to be there. And AI will be a tool that's like solved everything that we can see now. But I think people should have faith that there's going to be more problems to solve. It doesn't just stop.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't really like the AI doomerism. I mean, that's not to say that there may not be some short-term pain when a lot of people that are not in a position to be like retrained and losing their jobs to AI. But on a long enough timeline, I think that, like you said, we're just going to ask better questions and bigger questions and do shit that we couldn't even imagine doing now.
How do you use AI as a VC?
Oh man, I use it all the time. Like I have pro subscriptions to like every AI model and I use all of them multiple times a day. I primarily use them for digesting like scientific papers. If I'm like checking if what a company says they're doing makes sense. I also use them for reading contracts. We do like a decent amount of contract signing, whether it's like looking over share purchase agreements when doing investments, whether it's signing NDAs, whether it's even like reviewing some of the documents for this new fund that we're setting up. I don't just like put shit into AI and then just like trust the output, but I will use it to like sanity check things. And I use it all the time.
So what sort of prompt would that be? Would be like, read this contract. Is there any clause that could fuck me over?
Right. Yeah. Is there any red flags that I should look out for? That's a big one.
And it's funny because I've actually done the inverse because my process is always a work in progress, but I've actually said like, write me the perfect contract that protects me against X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And then if I want to use the clauses, I will. But
yeah, I mean, that's a good way to do it too. I'm trying to think if there's any other interesting ways that we've used it. I did use it quite a bit during the name brainstorming process. Although ultimately the name we came up with was not AI generated, but that was pretty helpful.
Yeah, I also, do you use it in like technology or science brainstorming about like future of the industry or where there might be new?
Sometimes. Some of the like deep research, I don't know if you've used deep research or like the Twitter, whatever the Grok version of like deep, I don't know if it's like deep think or whatever it's called, where it actually goes and searches the internet, like and iteratively keeps searching for stuff. That can be really useful if you want to say like, go find me the most high impact, like the 10 most high impact papers in this specific field and like briefly summarize them and then like predict based on that, like, what do you think the most interesting like innovations to come out in that field are going to be? Like that kind of, we've played around with that kind of stuff a little bit.
Yeah. I find it works well for like a topic like that.
Yeah.
But if I was to say, go and research this company, it doesn't know. There might be another company with the same name or a similar name, and then it hallucinates in that way.
There's definitely some hallucinations, and there are definitely things that it gets wrong, so you have to pay attention.
Yeah.
Like with the contract stuff, I think I have like above average like legal reading comprehension. I really liked like the business law classes that I took in college, and I have put clauses of contracts in there and been like, explain this, and then based on this clause, could someone do this and get away with it? And it will give me like the wrong answer. So definitely worth like still reading everything yourself and trying to decide if it's worth it. Yeah.
Where do you think AI fits in with people's workflows? And maybe a better question would be, how is a high performer using AI in like 10 years? What tasks are... Because I'm trying, I guess everyone's trying to think about it. Like, it's going to replace a lot of jobs. Yeah. But it's not very clear exactly what yet. And you could say like, oh, just lawyers. But then there are cases you still need a human. You need someone to take responsibility for what they're standing. You need someone to be in the courtroom.
So you're saying in 10 years, how does like an executive end up, or a founder end up using AI on a day-to-day basis?
Or maybe like if you were at college now.
Yeah.
What sort of skills or things are you learning? Because as you say there, your existing law knowledge was helpful to assess the...
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you really believe that AI is going to get like exponentially better over the next few years, there's almost no point in trying to become an expert in anything, because like in 5 years, the AI is going to be like way fucking better than anyone could be, right? Honestly, like it's such a corny, I feel like this is like a real cliche answer, but the best thing to probably do in college is to like join a frat and like learn how to make good friends while getting wasted, because that's going to be the one thing that AI can't replace. And that's how like deals are going to get done, just like they've always gotten done, right? By dudes getting like slightly fucked up at a bar. And no amount of like AI negotiation is probably going to take that away. So it may be the case that for the last 2 decades, you know, it was really easy to make money by being like a software engineer, someone who's very technical. But in the next 10 years, like if all the rote technical stuff is done by AI, now it's just about being like really good at forming human relationships and friendships. Because I still think a lot of deals will be done on that basis rather than like technological basis. One could also argue that AI will almost certainly kill SaaS, but it may not kill a lot of the more deep tech or biotech stuff, because there's a lot of like fundamental research that needs to be done in those spaces. It's not clear if AI can actually do research and come up with new shit or not. It can certainly build any SaaS app you want it to, but I don't know if it can actually like can discover new scientific truths.
And maybe the mechanism of AI could, but it doesn't have the data to do that.
Right.
So that's probably actually...
It's true. Yeah. Figuring out how to collect data and figuring out how to build businesses around data collection for real world domains. I mean, Peter Thiel's whole like complaint in 0 to 1 was that tech, you know, promised us flying cars, but instead it gave us 140 characters. That's like his little quote from the book, basically saying all the people that grew up in like the 70s and 80s reading science fiction thought that the future was going to be like all this magical, cool, like physical world shit. Instead, it was just like a bunch of social media and SaaS. But now that AI has made SaaS products like, you know, infinite and free to some extent, now maybe founders, if they will have to actually build these cool like physical products in order to make an impact.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good argument for LPs starting to pay more attention to like putting their money into deep tech or like the stuff that you guys invest in, because it is defensible in that way. Whereas SaaS is kind of going to be, I still think like the place where I think AI probably won't be able to touch is probably enterprise. Like you're saying there, if you're doing a massive fund formation for like a $100 billion fund or whatever, or $100 million fund, you're going to have to get a human to and I'm pretty sure it doesn't matter how good AI gets, you probably will still need a human to check it.
Probably.
Because of the way it works, like unless you can verify that it's not hallucinated or something.
That's true.
And lots of it is based on interpretation by a human anyway.
That's true.
So I guess in those like really high value use cases, but then all of the 99% of other use cases where it's not as important for it to be that precise, then AI will eat it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there will probably always need to be humans, but just very, very few of them.
Yeah, it's like I think with design, I think lots of website design and development will be taken over by AI, but there'll still be those really high value precision points where you still do need that human touch.
For sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, and also figuring out how to just like make things cohesive across the visual, the spoken, the text, like all of these different domains. Like I don't think any of the AIs are really good at doing all of that yet. So that's something that humans certainly need to still be able to have taste and figure out how to make things cohesive. That's like the current Twitter meme is like, this is the era of Rick Rubin. You know who Rick Rubin is?
Yeah,
the like producer, where there's that famous clip of him where he's I don't know how to do anything, but I do have good taste. And it's like, now everyone gets to just be a Rick Rubin.
Yeah, that's going to be the new power law cliche. Right. Everyone's I don't do anything. I'm just refining my taste all day.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is true. Like if you find a good idea, then that's actually one thing I would say about the latest. The thing I keep telling myself is like ideas have the highest leverage on work now, which is true.
It's true.
It's the
age of the idea guy.
Yeah, which is fantastic news because I feel like it makes it way more accessible for good ideas to come into the world.
Totally.
Which is cool.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting time.
Yeah.
You still have to be good at distribution and figuring out how to get people to like see your ideas, right? And that's going to be hard because as the space gets more and more crowded, it's harder to like stand out above the noise.
Yeah.
Right. This is exactly what happened in the music industry. It became really, really easy to make music. And now there's like, 10,000 songs uploaded to Spotify every day, and most of them get 0 plays.
Yeah.
So figuring out how to like crack distribution in the age of like infinite AI generated companies is going to be really, really hard.
Yeah, definitely. It's like a podcast. Any two schmucks can start having a conversation.
Right. Exactly. And no one's going to listen.
Yeah.
Maybe 1 or 2 people.
Yeah. But that's where specific areas of knowledge, I think that's a good avenue to go down.
Totally.
Because like this conversation doesn't compete with Joe Rogan. It competes with, well, I mean,
it might. No.
it
doesn't compete with Joe
probably
Rogan.
will, to be honest. But yeah. Last question.
Yes.
Any good dinner spots in this area?
Well, I'm very new, so we're going to have to do some exploration because I don't have any
nice.
favorites yet.
Nice.
I've only eaten at the Chinese takeout place across the street, and
Nice.
I think we got to step it up a little bit from that. So
Okay.
we'll find something good.
Should we hail a Waymo?
Let's do it, man.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
Okay, nice.
Thanks for coming.
Good
Let's do
conversation.
the Arnold.
Thank you
one.
for having
There we
me.
go.
Nice.